keynote address of the day, which is centered around the second sub-theme of WPRF 2023, Responsible Communications, your reputation, your influence, and your role. For this session, we have Isabel Lara, Chief Communications Officer, NPR, who has traveled all the way from Washington, D.C. to join us at WPRF 2023. Isabel is a veteran communications expert with over 20 years of experience in the field. During her tenure at NPR, she has demonstrated communications excellence in designing and implementing provocative press strategies around key news, programming, and organizational development that have built visibility, awareness, and audience for NPR and member stations. She has also led NPR's public messaging for a range of corporate issues and developments, including reputation management and strategy. Before joining NPR, Isabel worked at the National Education Association, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and the Hispanic Broadcasting Corporation in New York, and EI University in Caracas. She graduated cum laude with a degree in literature from Andres Bello in Caracas, and she has a master's in media studies from the New School in New York. Joining her on stage for a fireside chat just after her keynote address will be Nikhil Dey, Executive Director at Adfactors PR. May we please have you on stage, Isabel. Please put your hands together and welcome Isabel. The stage is all yours.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. It's amazing. I am so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me and for welcoming me to this beautiful conference. And once again, congratulations to all the winners. What a wonderful, wonderful event. So we're going to talk about responsible communications, your reputation, your influence, and your role. I am the Chief Communications Officer at NPR, that is National Public Radio in the United States. I don't know if you can hear it from here, but maybe you know some of our podcasts, or the Tiny Desk Contest, the Tiny Desk Concert. Many famous artists have performed. So anyway, let's get started. So what is responsible communications? Communication is key to building trust. Trust with your employees and your reputation with your partners and consumers and stakeholders. The communications division's role is to create consistent, trustworthy messaging. You all know this. But what is responsible communications? You need a plan. Planning is the most important factor to getting communications right. How soon should the communications team be involved? Immediately, right? As soon as possible. Never leave it for the last moment. We want to be there when the messages are being developed. We want to be there when the product is being developed. So what should you include in your plan? Goals, messaging, audience, timelines, hard questions. There's always going to be something unexpected. But if you have a plan, you can work it out. So I'm going to get right into a case study of something that happened to NPR recently that hopefully you are aware of. So we had our Twexit. We left Twitter in April of this year. But just in case, as background, I want to tell you a little bit about NPR. NPR was founded in 1971 as an alternative to commercial media. It is one of the most trusted news organizations in the United States. NPR's mission is to work in partnership with 250 member stations all over the country to create a more informed public. NPR is a nonprofit media company with three sources of revenue. Basically, listeners give us money. Even though the service is free, they give us money because they love what we do and they love listening to unbiased information. The other sources are philanthropy and sponsorship from corporations. On average, a very small percent of NPR's annual budget comes from grants from the federal government. And this is important information right there. Because on April 4th, at 10 p.m., I was sitting at home watching television when I got a call from the newsroom. It's never good when you get a call from the overnight editor in the newsroom. Something happened. You know, once I got a call during brunch, and it was that one of our international correspondents was in prison in Sudan. There's always something going on when the phone rings late at night. So Luis calls me and he says, open up Twitter and look at the label they put on our page. It says US state-affiliated media. That wasn't there before. So then we looked up the definition of what Twitter says is state-affiliated media. And it said it's media where the state exercises control over editorial content. And then in the second paragraph, it says, unlike the BBC in the UK or NPR in the US. So Twitter's definition of state-affiliated media intentionally said NPR was not one of these things. So immediately we start wondering, well, what happened? We start trying to get in touch with our contacts on Twitter, because we had a very good relationship with Twitter before that. And nobody's responding to any emails. And then every tweet that we would put out would have that label, which is questioning our content. It's questioning the independence of our journalism. So we decided to stop tweeting and to wait to see what happens. But in the meantime, I started creating a communications plan. And the first thing we needed was to talk to the social media people and make sure that we were already telling our listeners and our audience what was happening. So the issue was not with the funding or the revenue. The issue was with the independence of our journalism. That label was questioning our reputation. So we stopped tweeting, we changed our Twitter bio, and we changed the background image. So the background image started saying, always free and independent. And then in the bio, we had a little sentence at the end that said, you can find us every other place you read your news. And then we put out a statement from our CEO saying that we were very surprised to see this and that that label was unacceptable. Right away, reporters on Twitter started noticing and said, NPR hasn't tweeted, and they noticed that there was a little bit of humor in our bio. So part of the communications plan included getting support from organizations that support free media, like, for example, PEN America or the Freedom Forum, the Committee to Protect Journalists. So I reached out to people at these organizations and explained what had happened, and they immediately put statements out in our support. Can you play the video? This was a very interesting part of the support we started getting. Was our competitors, like the Washington Post, put out this video on TikTok that really explains what happened. Can you play it?
NPR in Washington. What is this?
We're labeling you as state-affiliated media because you're controlled by the government.
But we're not. We're a Washington-based nonprofit news organization, and based on your own rules posted to your site, we're not state-affiliated media.
But you do get some government funding.
Yes, the same funding that hundreds of public TV and radio stations also receive.
Elon, they said we can't do that.
We're looking into it.
You're the people who did it.
Don't worry about it. You'll be fine. Just tweet through it.
But this is dangerous, comparing us to actual state-affiliated media.
Elon, it's me again. Are you sure?
What did he say?
I have to give you this.
Are you serious?
It's how Elon requested we respond to all news media requests now.
Blink twice if you need help.
Am I allowed to blink?
So any good PR person knows that it's great when you can get somebody else to speak on your behalf. You know, when you can get a surrogate, and especially if it's the competition saying something on your behalf. But we also got a lot of trolling, especially on Twitter. People were saying all sorts of hateful things, like, do the world a favor, delete your entire operation, go away. Then there was this man who was specifically going against me, and he was saying, John Lansing, that is our CEO, is relying on the bargain bin PR counsel of Isabel Lara, who is woefully out of her depth. But we were getting all these insults. Now that you're suspending Twitter, please stop using the airways. Even my little dog got trolled. I don't know if you can read that, but it says 6% of that dog's food and bills are paid by the US tax dollars. So what did we include in this 14-page communications plan? Because it was 14 pages long. We had a very detailed timeline because we had so many different stakeholders that needed to be informed. We had our member stations, we had our clients, we had our sponsors, we had funders, and all of our staff, because for the past 10 years, we have been paying our journalists to go on social media, to use social media to tell their stories. So what were we going to do about them? Were we going to ask them to stop tweeting? Were we going to stop tweeting? We had 8 million followers. Like, that's a lot. Like, what was going to happen? So part of that planning, we took 8 days to plan. Part of the planning included talking to our research people and figuring out how much of our web traffic really came for Twitter. And it was only 1% of our web traffic that was coming from Twitter referral. What we had was a lot of engagement. So we needed to have messages to our staff. What would they do about their own social media? Messages to partners, messages that we would post on every NPR social media account, because we had our main social media account and we had one for every show, one for every host, and we needed to have statements to the press, because if there's something that reporters really are interested in, is stories about themselves and stories about the media. So April 12th at 9 a.m. was the day when we were going to leave Twitter. And we were having meetings at 8:30 every morning. The executive committee of NPR was having meetings to update each other on what we were doing. And then at 8:30 that day, we were going to say, do we leave Twitter? Is it go or no go? So then, of course, like at 8:45, I got a call from the New York Times saying, we know you're going to leave Twitter today, and we're going to publish a story. So I said, well, we haven't left Twitter yet, and you really don't have a story until we do. So how about you wait for me to text you so you know that we have actually left Twitter? Because right now, you only have speculation. You don't really have a story. And part of my reasoning was, we are a news organization, so NPR had to have that story first. It's wonderful that the New York Times wanted to cover it, but our newsroom needed to break that story. So I negotiated with a New York Times reporter. At the same time, we were having our software that puts things up on the web was having failures. But finally, at 8:59, everything started working, and we were able to post our final tweet. That tweet included the reason that we were leaving, but also where to find NPR on other places, our app, our newsletters, and other places. If you notice here, we have the main NPR account and NPR Extra, which is the account that the communications team runs that has behind-the-scenes information. We got so much press. It was ridiculous. It was everywhere. I mean, New York Times had it at the same time as we did, but the Financial Times, NBC, so many media were covering us. And the headline was, NPR is the first major US news outlet to stop using Twitter. So here I gathered some of the lessons that we learned from this experience. A detailed communications plan is always a good thing. That's just key. Having everything down on paper, thinking about all the questions that people could ask, everything that could go wrong, everything that you might need. Who needs to hear it before it happens, right? Because nobody likes to be surprised. Everybody likes to feel like they're part of something and that they know ahead of time. Take your time. We took 8 days and nothing happened. We could have taken a little bit longer. We could have done it right away, but we took the time that we needed. Another important lesson, especially for me, because I've been working with reporters for so long, and I work with reporters inside my organization and outside, I always feel that I have to respond to them right away. Well, sometimes when you don't respond, they use the last statement that you gave them. And in our case, that worked really well because it was a statement from our CEO. Then always try to negotiate with a reporter when your story has leaked. You can always offer them something. It's a really bad idea to just not answer the phone or to think that you can avoid them. And then one final thing is the media is endlessly interested in stories about the media. I mean, I can't tell you how many emails and requests we were getting about any specific change. If Musk tweeted or if somebody, if there was a slight change, we would get questions, not from technology blogs, but from Reuters, CNN, BBC, because they were also labeled at the same time as we were. And then, please, this is a very important lesson. Never tell a reporter that he sucks. Elon Musk emailed our tech reporter, and the email didn't say anything. It was just the subject line said, "You suck." So of course our reporter included that in his story, tweeted about it, printed it, and has it framed on his desk. So, even if you feel terrible about a reporter, never say something that you don't want on print to be included in his story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you.
That was a real storm in a Twitter cup, or an X cup. The topic that we're going to explore a little bit about is responsible communication. And in the context of the case study, two things stood out for me. One was, of course, prepare, and you did prepare, though it was a medium that required immediacy. And one of the old rules was, in crisis, the need for speed, and it was interesting to see that you said, actually take your time. So respond, don't react. Great advice.
Especially when it's a story like that, because all the cards were really in our hand. Like, until we said something or until we did something, there wasn't a new story. I mean, Musk was doing things. He changed the label twice. It was first U.S. state-affiliated media, then it was government-funded, and then I don't know if he changed it again. But if we didn't do anything, then the story wasn't moving along. So sometimes you feed a story when you respond right away without considering and thinking through.
Perfect, thank you. So I'd like to just broaden this beyond just what you presented and try and learn from your experiences of working in the media and being the PR for a media outlet. When I was going through some of the stuff that you've written, this line jumped out at me. How and when people get their news is something that clearly fascinates you and has a lot of interest. The pandemic has clearly changed the way people consume news, and therefore I'm guessing how media houses are serving news. So from being in the epicenter of that, can you share any sort of real learnings from?
Yes, absolutely. So I always joke that when you do media for a media company, you really have to love reporters very much, because they are your staff, they are your constituents, they are the people you talk to all the time. And I grew up with media. My grandfather was a journalist. My mother, I have so many friends who are journalists. So we are very passionate about how you get your news. And that certainly changed during the pandemic. NPR has the most listened to news talk radio shows in the morning and in the evening. But during the pandemic, people were not going to work, so people stopped driving. So that really changed our audience. The morning show suffered very much at the beginning because people were just not driving to work. People started listening in the afternoons, and people started listening on their speakers, on their smart speakers. So streaming went up while the radio went down. We had some immediate reactions to the pandemic. We created a podcast that was called the Coronavirus Daily. We created that, I think it was March 18, so 6 days after we were sent home. And that podcast came out every day with information about the coronavirus. And we also created a live show at 9 p.m. in the evening where we answered listener questions. So it was like a modern take on a traditional call-in show, because people would send their questions on social media or they would leave voicemails. And every night we had experts answering questions. And that helped a little bit stem the tide, because yes, people's consumption of media changed completely during those days.
Perfect. So both time of day, form factor, way of consuming.
And the platform, right? The
And
platform they were listening to.
You mentioned podcast, and I found it fascinating as I was reading about NPR that you were real early movers into the podcast ecosystem. I think 2005 is when you embraced podcasts, and by 2015, if the number's right, is you had 94 million downloads. And your podcast continued to really grow. In fact, I was talking to Asim a little while ago, and he was rattling off the names of 2 or 3 podcasts. So you have an audience here that is consuming your podcasts.
Wonderful.
Can you share learnings about what probably is working in podcasts? Because it seems to be a medium that's popping in India right now.
Yes, podcasts have just exploded everywhere. Well, podcast is basically radio on demand, right? Like everybody, especially the new generations, they want to hear the news and entertainment when they're ready for it. There is very few things that are appointment television or appointment listening these days. So podcasts are just on demand. But also, I think there is a very low barrier to entry because people, NPR has very sophisticated recording devices and studios. But during the pandemic, people started recording from home. So almost anybody, if you want, can publish a podcast. The problem is there are so many out there, right? There are millions of podcasts. And one thing that is, when you listen to a podcast like Pop Culture Happy Hour, which is just, it sounds like it's just for friends talking about movies or music, and you think, well, I can do that. I talk to my friends all the time about movies, but you're not that interesting. You need a really good editor. The people who do Pop Culture Happy Hour, they spend 45 minutes talking or 2 hours talking, and then a very good editor cuts it down, right, to 15 minutes when everybody says the smartest things and they sound so witty. So if you're going to start a podcast, make sure you have a good editor, because just putting your phone down and recording your friends and you talking, that's not going to be interesting to anybody but your friends.
Perfect, thank you, that's useful. Radio as a medium, at least in my experience, seems to have been one of the more neglected avenues for public relations, and therefore possibly has a lot of opportunity if we look at it as a great way to earn attention. Any tips you could have for maybe all of us here on how we could better leverage radio to tell stories?
Well, please don't ignore radio. Radio reaches, in the United States, 98% of Americans have listened to the radio in the past week. Radio reaches everybody. Radio reaches people in an emergency. If you have an actual radio with batteries, it reaches people when there is no electricity. So radio has a public service, and especially in cars, we were talking earlier, and I come from the newspaper world, and newspapers were disrupted by the internet 20 years ago. Well, the radio has not, because people continue listening in their cars. So please consider radio when you're pitching as part of your media plan. And, just include it as part of your media plan. Listen to talk shows, figure out who the hosts are, who the producers are. But the most important thing is getting somebody who is a good talker, right? Because on the radio, you don't have any images. You only have words, and you have people's voices. But the other hand of that, the flip side of that, is that you create a very intimate connection, because there is nothing that connects more with people than the human voice. And during the pandemic, because so many people were so lonely, I was by myself in my apartment with my dog. And when I turned on the radio and I heard the voices of the hosts, I felt a real connection. And we started getting so many letters from people saying that listening to our journalists who were working from home and sometimes hearing their dog bark or hearing a baby cry in the background, it just felt like we were in there together with them, because everybody was going through the same.
Yeah. The AI is a hot topic right now, and fake news seems to be flooding our timelines. So with I guess technology speeding up the capability to create deep fakes and really confuse audiences, how do you see the role of a responsible communicator shaping up? Do you think?
Well, I think it's more important than ever to have responsible communicators, like the students who just got all those awards, because the world is going to be so much more complicated when you're out there as communications directors or in your own agencies, because fake news and AI, they can create things that are so similar to the real thing. So you really have to pay attention to who the source is, and you have to be ready, especially for crisis communications. If fake news comes out about your firm or about one of your executives, just to make sure that you are able to find out what the source is, that it's a credible media, And it's a great opportunity for communications professionals to also partner with trusted media companies and only provide interviews, only provide information to media companies that are trusted, independent news media.
You know, one of the earlier speakers had a slide up there which said the top 3 drivers of what is grabbing attention. There was sustainability and ESG, responsible leadership, and corporate reputation. So on one hand, responsible does seem to be no longer boring, but the new cool in a way. But on the other hand, what sells is clickbaity, shitty content, right? So in this dichotomy, what do you think communicators like all of us can do to embrace responsible storytelling?
Well, I think the most important thing is having a good story to tell and having a good voice to tell that story. When you have a compelling story and you have a compelling spokesperson for that story, you are going to be able to break through the news. And if you can't have that, make sure that you have a cute animal. Animals are always great. When I used to work at the Air and Space Museum, which is the most visited museum in the world, I don't know if any of you have been there to see the space shuttle or the Wright Flyer, we always got upset because the National Zoo had pandas, and whenever a panda was born, you could forget about any other news, you know? Cute animal pictures, that beats everything.
Yeah, so I can't agree more. I have a lovely little dog called Cookie, and everybody I meet seems to know about Cookie because I'm always talking about Cookie. But back to responsible communication. Another phrase that caught my attention in your timeline when you were, which you write about, is something which you call a healthy news diet. And as communicators, what is your advice to us on how to keep our news diet healthy?
Yeah, well, that's, I think that it's very hard now, especially with news fatigue. You know, there is so many bad news out there, and it's so hard sometimes to keep watching the news or keep reading. But it's so important to stay informed. And it's very important also to break out of your echo chamber, because if you're always listening to media or to reporters or voices that agree with you, then sometimes you don't know what's going on, and some bad news can catch you by surprise. But when I started talking about the news diet was because, well, I work for a news organization, and we are trying to reach a younger audience because, you know, the young people, they don't have a radio at home. So we're trying to figure out where young people get their news. So whenever I interview an intern, you know, I ask them, where do you get your news? Like, what is your news diet? Like, what is your first contact of the day with the news? Like, for me, it used to be Twitter, not anymore. Now it's generally the NPR app. But, you know, you get your news from social media. My sister, she is 10 years younger than me. She gets news from Instagram. So many young people are getting news from TikTok these days. So I like buying the paper, you know, like the physical newspaper. But even I only buy it on weekends now because it's when I have time to open up the paper, you know, with the coffee. So it's very, what's interesting about the news diet is what people consider news, because it's information that is useful to you. So sometimes on your social media timeline, on your Facebook, you can find out, oh, my friend Isabel is in India. You know, what's she doing over there? Oh, I have a friend. I can tell her that. That, for somebody, might be news. Just like you can follow the AP reporter, you know, and if they're posting from a news conference, you can find out first what happened. I think that's what I love most about social media, is that I follow so many reporters, and it feels like sometimes they're writing the story with their posts. So you know what the news is, or you know what's coming in that story by following their posts. But they have gotten more savvy these days, and sometimes they save it for the paywall.
You know, that's interesting. On the topic of the paywall, I was going through the NPR site, and up popped this wonderful message which read, were you expecting a paywall? Question mark, not our style. And this, I then read up a little bit, seems to be a new initiative that NPR has started as part of a broader campaign to turn audiences into donors. And I thought that was really interesting, and maybe we can learn a little bit from you on how this is working, what's the rate of conversion? Yeah.
So that campaign started very recently. But like I was telling you, public media is something very special. It doesn't happen in my country, in Venezuela. We don't have anything like that. That you have a news organization that gives away the news for free, but members pay because they want to. So people subscribe, and for like, we're not going to give you anything if you surprise. We might give you a tote bag, or we might give you a mug or a sticker, but everybody gets the news for free. But you choose to pay for the news because you appreciate the news. So that has been very successful on the radio for 50 years. We have something that is called Pledge Week, when people are hosts and sometimes are news directors, like my friend Teresa in the audience right now. They go on the radio and they say, you know, it is expensive to create news, and you hear us every day. Why don't you give us $20 a month, or any amount of money that you want to? So that worked very well on the radio. But now, some people don't listen to the radio. They listen to our podcasts, or they watch a Tiny Desk, or they just read the news on the website. So they were not giving to their member stations. So this is a new thing that we're doing, where we're trying to convince people to create a relationship. And what's really interesting is that many other news organizations are also trying to get people to become members, but they become members because they have to pay for access. We're not doing that. That's not our style. You will continue to get our news for free, but you will feel good about yourself because you are contributing to public media.
So that's a perfect example of responsible communication, right? Maybe if there are questions from the audience, I'd love to invite a few. I don't know if I'm allowed to, but I may be irresponsible. Mr. Prabhu, am I allowed? Yeah, I'm allowed. Okay. Yes. Any of you would like to ask Isabel anything on the topic of responsible communication or radio or her dog? Yes, we've got a hand right up there at the back.
You have really good eyesight.
I'm aided. Yes, we are getting a mic to you. It is on its way. So till then, tell us your doggy's name.
Huh?
Your doggy's name.
Oh, Nacho.
Nacho, okay.
Like a nacho chip.
Okay. So Nacho and Cookie have to meet. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Usha. I'm from Dr. Reddy's. Please bear with me while I gather my thoughts. This goes back to the trolling bit that you showed us in your presentation. We know in this country that in response to certain statements, there's a pretty strong troll army that can get galvanized very quickly. I'm also aware that there's probably a pretty strong troll army that got galvanized in response to Elon Musk and his actions over there, and you showed us a slide. So did you have an action plan to counter that as part of responsible communication? I am aware of the positive actions you took, but how do you counter swathes of accusations, allegations, irresponsible comments being made about your organization?
Thank you for that question. So we usually advise people to ignore the trolls, because when you respond to them, you're feeding them. But we do have a very responsible security firm that we hire, because some of our journalists have received threats. And when it's a threat, when it's a post, when they're doxing them, like posting their address or their phone number, then we do get the security firm involved. And sometimes we have had to hire security for people when they're getting trolled with, like, sometimes racist comments or threats. But in general, my advice as the PR person is don't respond to them. And sometimes I will get an email from a host. Oh, I have to respond to this person. They're so stupid. I have to respond. And I'm like, no, by responding, you are giving them attention. They're going to keep on responding to you, and it's going to become a thing. Just ignore them, and that's what I did with the one who was trolling my dog. I really wanted to block him, but if I blocked him, then he would know that I had blocked him, and he would win. So just taking the high road and ignoring them, unless it's a threat, and then you really have to take action.
So do nothing sometimes is great strategy. On that note, thank you so very much, Isabel, for flying all the way in and sharing your knowledge and your learnings with this audience.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was very fun.
Thank you so much, both Isabel and Nikhil. Enlightening, impactful, fresh off the press, consistent, trustworthy messaging, what's the plan, asking the tough and hard questions. What a truly powerful story of empowerment and standing up for what you believe in. What a lovely interaction after too.